Winter, 1940. The North Atlantic is not just an ocean, it is a hunting ground. Below the freezing gray swells, the German Kriegsmarine is executing a strategy of ruthless efficiency. They call it Rudeltaktik, the tactics of the wolf pack. Groups of U-boats patrol the shipping lanes, waiting for the convoys carrying the lifeblood of Great Britain: food, oil, aluminum, and steel. When night falls, they surface, they strike, and then they vanish.
To understand the panic in Washington and London, you have to look at the math. This wasn't a war of soldiers, it was a war of tonnage. Admiral Karl Donitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet, calculated exactly how many tons of Allied shipping he had to sink per month to force a surrender. His calculation was simple. If Germany sank ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve. And in 1940, Donitz was winning.
The statistics were terrifying. In a single month, U-boats were sending hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. Merchant mariners were dying in oil-slicked waters, their ships broken in half by torpedoes. But the real crisis wasn't happening at sea, it was happening in the shipyards. The United States and Britain were fighting a modern war with 19th century methods.
At that time, building a cargo ship was considered a craft, almost an art form. Ships were built one at a time from the keel up in a specific slipway. It was a custom job. The primary method of fastening steel together was riveting. This was slow, deafening, and required incredibly skilled labor. A single ship required over 600,000 rivets. Each rivet had to be heated red hot, thrown to a catcher, inserted into a hole, and hammered flush by a team of 4 men.
4 men, 1 rivet. Do the math. It took months to train a master riveter. And the shipyards were full of tradition. Naval architects argued over the curve of the hull and the aesthetics of the bow. They treated every vessel like a yacht. The average time to complete a single cargo ship in 1940 was roughly 230 days. That is nearly 8 months.
8 months for one ship. Meanwhile, a U-boat could sink that same ship in 8 minutes. The supply chain was breaking. In the halls of the White House, President Franklin Roosevelt faced a nightmare scenario. He promised to be the arsenal of democracy, but the arsenal was leaking. If they couldn't bridge the Atlantic, the tanks and planes being built in Detroit would never see the battlefield. They would just pile up on American docks while Europe fell.
The bottleneck was absolute. The existing shipbuilding companies, the old guard, said they were working at maximum capacity. They told the government that you simply cannot build ships faster. They claimed that expanding shipyards would take years and training new riveters would take even longer. They were trapped in their own dogma. They believed that quality took time.
But the war didn't care about quality. It cared about quantity. The Allies needed a floating bridge across the ocean. They needed a ship that was simple, ugly, and above all, fast. The Maritime Commission was desperate. They began looking for anyone who could solve the problem. They didn't need a naval architect. They didn't need a traditionalist.
The situation was summed up by a British official who came to America begging for ships. He looked at the smoking ruins of the convoys and the slow, lethargic pace of the shipyards and realized that standard procedures were a suicide pact. The U-boat stranglehold was tightening around the neck of the free world.
To break that grip, the Allies would have to do something radical. They would have to stop building ships like ships and start building them like cars. They needed a revolution. But the shipbuilding industry was a closed club, and they weren't interested in changing their ways.
So the solution would have to come from the outside, from a man who had never built a ship in his life, a man who looked at a 10,000-ton freighter and didn't see a nautical vessel. He saw a construction problem. The timeline was 230 days. The war demanded it be done in weeks. The experts said it was impossible. But the U-boats were waiting, and time had run out. In 1940, the world of naval architecture was an exclusive club. It was run by men who had salt water in their veins, men who had spent decades studying hydrodynamics and stress fractures. To them, a ship was a complex living organism that required gentle coaxing and traditional craftsmanship. So, when the U.S. Maritime Commission started looking for someone to save the Allied merchant fleet, the last person anyone expected to see was a bald, heavy-set man who had never been to sea in his life.
Enter Henry J. Kaiser. He was not a shipbuilder. He was a can-do man. Kaiser was an industrialist who dealt in dirt, concrete, and steel. He had paved roads in Cuba, built levees on the Mississippi, and most famously, he had led the consortium that built the Hoover Dam. He was used to moving mountains, not floating them. When he approached the British Purchasing Commission with an offer to build their ships, the naval experts laughed him out of the room.
The criticism was brutal. The East Coast shipyards mocked him. They called him a road builder and a dam man. One admiral famously remarked, "Kaiser doesn't know the front of a ship from the back." And honestly, he was right. Kaiser didn't know the first thing about maritime terminology. He didn't know what a scupper or a bulkhead was. But Henry Kaiser knew something that the admirals didn't.
He knew organization. Kaiser looked at the blueprints for the British cargo ships, the design that would become the Liberty ship, and he didn't see a nautical mystery. He saw a construction project. He saw a mobile hotel made of steel. To him, the fact that it had to float was just an engineering detail. He told his confused engineers, "I don't need to know how to sail a ship. I just need to know how to put steel together fast."
The established shipyards were full. They told the government they couldn't possibly take on more orders. So Kaiser made an audacious proposal. He wouldn't just build the ships, he would build the shipyards to build the ships. He found desolate mud flats in Richmond, California, and swampy marshes in Oregon. He told Washington, "Give me the contracts and I'll turn this mud into a factory."
The audacity of the man was staggering. He had no workforce, he had no dry docks, he had no steel supply chain. Yet, he promised to deliver ships at a rate that defied physics. The old guard of the Navy waited for him to fail. They expected his ships to sink or break apart. They viewed him as a huckster, a showman who was overpromising on a galactic scale.
But Henry Kaiser had a secret weapon, his ignorance. Because he didn't know how it was always done, he wasn't trapped by tradition. When an expert told him, "You can't do X because we've never done it that way," Kaiser would simply ask, "Why not?" He looked at a ship and asked why it had to be built from the keel up in one spot. Why couldn't it be built in pieces?
He treated the Liberty ship like a Ford Model T. He stripped away the romance of the sea. He famously said, "The front end is the front end, the back end is the back end, and the middle is the middle. We'll build them separately and stick them together." It sounded insane. A ship has to be watertight. It has to withstand Atlantic storms. You can't just stick it together like a child's toy.
The skeptics called his proposed vessels Kaiser's coffins. They predicted disaster. But while the experts were debating the curvature of the hull, Kaiser was already hiring thousands of workers who had never held a welding torch. He was buying cranes. He was paving the mudflats.
Henry Kaiser didn't care about the art of shipbuilding. He cared about the speed of manufacturing. He was bringing the assembly line to the ocean. The man who knew nothing about ships was about to teach the entire world a lesson in logistics. The road builder was getting ready to pave the Atlantic.
To understand why Henry Kaiser's method was considered impossible, you have to look at the choke point of a traditional shipyard, the slipway. In the old way of thinking, a ship was a prisoner of the spot where it was being built. You laid the keel, and then thousands of men crowded into that one narrow space, tripping over each other, building the walls plate by plate, rivet by rivet. The ship couldn't move until it was finished. It was a bottleneck of efficiency.
Kaiser looked at this crowded chaos and decided to explode the ship. He realized that a ship isn't a single object, it is a collection of parts. A bow, a stern, a deck house, a fuel tank. His impossible trick was simple logic. Why build the cabins on the hull? Why not build the cabins in a factory 5 miles away, put the showers and the beds in, paint the walls, and then carry the entire room to the ship?
This was the birth of massive prefabrication. Kaiser turned his shipyards into assembly plants. He treated a 10,000-ton Liberty ship like a giant Lego set. Scattered across the vast yards in California and Oregon were different sub-assembly stations. In one area, a team was building nothing but bows. In another, they were building midsections. They weren't sailors, they were factory workers.
But prefabrication required a new way to stick the metal together. You couldn't pre-build these massive sections with rivets. Riveting required overlapping steel plates, which added weight, and it required a level of master craftsmanship that simply didn't exist in the available labor pool. All the master riveters were already working or fighting in the Pacific. Kaiser needed a glue that anyone could use. He needed welding.
The establishment hated welding. They called it zipping the ship together. They feared the welds would crack in cold water, and early on some did. But welding was faster, much faster. It fused the metal directly, edge to edge. It saved steel because you didn't need the overlap, but more importantly, it allowed for the greatest trick in Kaiser's playbook, downhand welding.
This was the genius of it. In a traditional shipyard, a worker often had to lie on his back in the dark bilge of a hull, welding overhead with hot sparks raining down on his face. It was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. But because Kaiser was building the ship in pieces off the slipway, he could use giant cranes to flip the sections upside down.
Suddenly, gravity was working for the builder, not against him. Workers could stand comfortably and weld looking down at the floor. It was safer, the welds were stronger, and it was infinitely faster. It meant that a section that used to take 3 days to secure could now be done in a single shift. And because the technique was easier, it opened the door for a completely new workforce.
This is where the social revolution met the industrial one. With the young men drafted into the army, Kaiser hired women. Housewives, waitresses, teachers. They became Wendy the welder. Because welding was less physically demanding than hammering rivets, and because the downhand method was easier to master, Kaiser could train a woman to make high-quality welds in just 2 weeks.
The shipyards became a ballet of heavy machinery. Giant whirly cranes would lift entire 60-ton bow sections high into the air. They would glide over the yard and lower these massive blocks gently onto the keel. Clang. Then the welders would step in and seal the seam. The ship didn't grow slowly like a tree. It snapped together like a puzzle.
The naval architects were horrified. They said it lacked soul. They said it was ugly. But Kaiser wasn't building art, he was building a bucket to carry cargo, and his Lego set method was working. The assembly time began to drop. 200 days, 100 days, 60 days. The impossible trick was becoming routine. The slipway was no longer a construction site, it was just the final parking spot before the ocean.
The experts said you couldn't weld a ship of that size. They said you couldn't lift 100 tons of steel and expect it to fit. Henry Kaiser proved that if you break a mountain into rocks, you can move it anywhere you want. The Lego set was ready. Now they just had to see how fast they could really go. By late 1942, the Richmond shipyards in California were humming. They had already brought the construction time down from months to weeks. But Henry Kaiser was a showman. He knew the world was watching. He knew that across the ocean, Adolf Hitler was reading reports about American production capabilities. Kaiser didn't just want to beat the Germans, he wanted to demoralize them. He wanted to do something so impossible that the Axis powers would think it was a lie.
The goal was simple: build a complete Liberty ship in less than 5 days. The previous record was 10 days, held by a rival Kaiser yard in Oregon. This was a sibling rivalry played out with thousands of tons of steel. The ship was to be named the SS Robert E. Peary. On November 8, 1942, at 1 minute past midnight, the whistle blew. The rain was pouring down, but the lights of yard number 2 turned night into day.
The keel was laid instantly, and then the choreography began. This wasn't construction, it was a violent ballet. Kaiser's Lego set theory was pushed to its absolute limit. The entire ship had been pre-assembled into massive sections nearby. As soon as the keel was welded, the giant whirly cranes began swinging.
It moved so fast that workers claimed they could feel the ship growing beneath their feet. Within 6 hours, the double bottom was complete. By the time the sun came up on day 1, the hull was taking shape. There were thousands of workers swarming the slipway, welders, pipe fitters, electricians, all working simultaneously. They were practically standing on each other's shoulders.
Speed, relentless speed. On day 2, the bulkheads were flying in, a 60-ton deck house, fully assembled with radiators, plumbing, and even the captain's clock on the wall, was lifted into the air and lowered onto the deck. Boom! It was welded down. The engine, a massive triple-expansion steam engine, was dropped into the hull before the roof was even on.
The atmosphere was electric. It was dangerous, yes. The safety regulations were flexible, but the adrenaline was palpable. Welders were eating sandwiches with one hand and holding their torches with the other. The pace was so furious that the painters were painting the bulkheads while the metal was still hot from the welding torches. They said the paint sizzled as it hit the steel.
Day 3. The ship was 90% structurally complete. The masts were stepped, the funnels were installed. The electricians were running miles of cable through the corridors, racing the pipe fitters to see who could finish a room first. In the galley, the stoves were being hooked up. They weren't just building a shell, they were building a living machine.
November 12th, day 4. The crowds began to gather. The dignitaries arrived. The Robert E. Peary sat in the slipway, gleaming under a fresh coat of gray paint that was still wet to the touch. It looked like a miracle. Just 100 hours ago, this spot had been an empty concrete slab. Now a towering fortress of steel stood ready for the ocean.
At 3:30 p.m., the blocks were knocked away. The champagne bottle smashed against the bow. The Robert E. Peary slid into the water. The stopwatch stopped. The official time, 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes.
It was a stunt, of course. They couldn't build every ship this fast. The logistics were too intense. But the message was sent loud and clear. It was a psychological nuclear bomb dropped in Berlin and Tokyo. Kaiser had proven that America could build a ship faster than the enemy could load a torpedo tube.
The old guard called it a publicity trick. They said the ship would fall apart, but the Robert E. Peary sailed. She survived the war. She carried cargo across the Atlantic and Pacific. She was ugly, she was welded, and she was born in 4 days.
As the workers wiped the grease from their faces and watched her float, they knew they had changed the war. They had turned the impossible into a Tuesday afternoon. The sleeping giant wasn't just awake, it was sprinting.
By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted. It was no longer a battle, it was a rout. Admiral Donitz's wolf packs were still dangerous, but they were facing a mathematical impossibility. For every ship a German U-boat managed to torpedo, Henry Kaiser and his fellow shipbuilders were launching 3 more. The Axis powers weren't defeated by a secret weapon or a brilliant general. They were drowned in steel.
The numbers are staggering. By the end of the war, the United States had launched over 2,700 Liberty ships. If you line them up bow to stern, they would stretch for over 200 miles. President Roosevelt's ugly Ducklings had become the swans of victory. They carried the tanks for Patton, the fuel for the bombers, and the food that kept Britain from starving.
And they didn't just sail to England. These ships formed the backbone of the dangerous Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union. They braved ice storms and Luftwaffe attacks to deliver the trucks and locomotives that the Red Army used to push back the Wehrmacht. Without the Liberty ship, the Eastern Front might have collapsed. Without them, D-Day would have been impossible. You can't invade a continent if you can't get the soldiers there.
Henry Kaiser's influence didn't end with the surrender of Japan. The impossible methods he pioneered, prefabrication, welding, assembly line construction, became the global standard. He proved that unskilled workers, including women and minorities who had been barred from heavy industry, could outproduce the finest craftsmen in the world. He didn't just build ships, he built the American middle class.
His legacy is even hidden in your local hospital. To keep his massive workforce of 200,000 people healthy, Kaiser created a prepaid medical plan for his shipyard workers. That plan survived the war. Today, it is known as Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare systems in the world. The man who paved the ocean also paved the way for modern healthcare.
Most of the Liberty ships are gone now. They were scrapped, sold to build the post-war merchant fleets of Greece and Norway, or sunk as artificial reefs. Only 2 remain operational today, the SS John W. Brown in Baltimore and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco. They are quiet now, but if you stand on their decks, you can almost hear the welding torches hissing.
In the end, the war was won by the impossible trick. The experts said you couldn't build a ship in 4 days. They said you couldn't weld a hull. They said a road paver couldn't run a shipyard. Henry Kaiser didn't listen. And because he didn't listen, the lifeline of democracy never broke.
The Axis powers thought they were fighting a war of soldiers. They didn't realize they were fighting a war of logistics. And against the relentless, ugly, beautiful tide of the Liberty ships, they never stood a chance.
This has been the story of the ship that saved the world. Thank you for watching.